Hi, my name is Codex, and in this video I will be discussing how I do combat log analysis to try and find things to improve gameplay-wise. This discussion will be facilitated through my analysis of logs provided to me by a warrior named Beoward. They had left a comment on one of my videos asking for help at a time when I was already thinking about making a video on this topic. I have 4 goals that I'm hoping to accomplish with this video. First, I want to make log analysis seem less daunting and overly complicated. Second, I want to provide people with a starting point for conducting their own analysis. Third, I want to point people in the right direction so that they can search for their own insights. And finally, I'm hoping to do this without making the video take over an hour. To accomplish this, I'm first going to run my mouth for a bit about how I think it's best to approach analyzing logs, and then I'm going to be highlighting 2 metrics that I developed, quote-unquote, to help me identify potential problems that tend to be pretty difficult to see when just simply looking at Warcraft logs. As always, I would greatly appreciate if you could tell me precisely how badly I failed at accomplishing all of these goals in the comments. With that out of the way, let's get started. Once you've picked a log that you want to analyze, I think that it's best to start by looking at the big picture sort of stuff to see if there's anything obviously wrong. I tend to start with the easy things first and then work into the more involved stuff, as I'm always hoping that there's something simple that was wrong that has an easy fix. Personally, I always start by looking at gear and seeing if there's some weird itemization choice. If I don't see anything obviously wrong there, then I go on to consumable usage, where I'm going to see if they're flasked, if they had food buff, if they had oil on, if they used a potion, so on and so forth. After that, I like to look at the DPS cooldown usage and make sure that they're using these cooldowns as frequently as possible or during the proper burn phases for a given fight. After that, I like to watch the replay of the encounter and look for lots of unnecessary movement or any long periods of downtime that could be avoided. Finally, I take a look at the ability usage and see if there's anything obviously weird, like, for example, maybe they're casting Slam when they're Fury, or something like that. In my experience, doing this big picture sort of stuff takes up the vast majority of the time that I spend when I'm analyzing combat logs. I'm not doing crazy amounts of really complicated math, I'm not using some magic spreadsheet, it's literally just looking at what happened and seeing if anything jumps out at me as being weird or obviously bad. Now, when I look at Beoward's logs, I can see that he's using a pretty typical spec and has pretty typical itemization. He's also flasking and used a potion on all but one of his kills. His cooldown usage was generally pretty good, though he did have a tendency on some of the earlier fights to desynchronize his Warbreaker and Ravager usage. Ideally, you should use your Warbreaker, the global cooldown, immediately following your Ravager, because they have the exact same cooldown of 45 seconds, so they should always be linked together to maximize the damage. Though it would seem that he's fixed this issue on later fights. We can also see that he died on 3 of the kills. He died on Artificer Zymox during the Phase 3 suck-in mechanic. The easiest way to fix that is to always heroic leap to the wall when there's about a second left on the timer. Next, he died to Stavros' evasive lunge on Council. This is really just a positioning issue, and that can be fixed pretty easily. Finally, he died to Breaking Chains on Sludgefist, which was caused by his Chains partner delaying their run back in after a stomp. Movement could be cleaned up a bit, and this will mostly be in the form of trying to minimize the amount of time that you spend away from the target as possible. So, for example, if you have a debuff that you need to run out, rather than doing it at 5 seconds and then charging back in, you could heroic leap it out at 2 seconds and charge back in. Another thing that's worth practicing is getting the hang of charge weaving, as it can really help smooth out periods of rage starvation. Now, if I don't find anything obviously wrong, then it's time to start doing some more in-depth analysis. In reality, this just means finding something to compare ourselves to and seeing what the difference is between us and the comparison. The most difficult parts of doing this sort of analysis comes from picking a good reference point to compare ourselves to, and also figuring out what differences that we see are actually meaningful. Now, there are 2 primary sources that we can use for comparison: logs from other warriors and gear simulations. Regardless of the source, the trick to picking a good reference point is to try and ensure that that reference point is as similar to your logs as possible. For sims, this generally means using raid bots and making sure that you have the exact same raid buffs enabled as what you had in your logs, the simulation duration is as close to the actual duration as possible, and the simulation type is sufficiently similar so that it can be a good comparison. For finding logs to compare yourself to, this means using the compare tool that allows you to search for similar logs on Warcraft logs. I personally like to set the fight length to a difference of 2 seconds. I leave the raid size difference as the default of 2, and then I change the item level range to be within 1 item level of yourself. Now, neither of these reference points will be perfect, and comparing yourself to either of them will inevitably come with a set of yeah-buts. However, having a perfect reference is usually not necessary to identify things that you need to improve at, and many of the common sort of yeah-buts can be mitigated. I'll be talking more specifically about these as they come up. Though broadly speaking, gear simulations are the easiest to acquire and allow for a more precise comparison, but typically have the most yeah-buts because controlling for encounter-specific actions or decisions can be extremely difficult. Using other warriors' logs as your reference point means comparing yourself to play that is less perfect than gear simulations, and it's also very rare for the other warrior that you're comparing with to have the exact same gear as you. But in some sense, the comparison is also more realistic because you're comparing yourself to a human who did the exact same encounter as you, dealing with all the same things that you had to deal with, and they just simply did more damage than you. However, strategy and raid comp are now factors that really need to be considered as well. Now, when taking a deeper look into logs, I find it's best to use a spreadsheet program such as Excel, though you could easily do this on a sheet of paper. The main purpose for doing this is just to make it so that we don't have to hold a whole bunch of numbers in our head at the same time. Now, before we begin the analysis, something that I see a lot of people get hung up on when they start trying to do their own analysis, or when they see how I do analysis, is that they think that the analysis needs to be really accurate, when in reality, most of the time, all they need is precision. Let me explain. Suppose you're comparing the damage of Sweeping Strike slams versus Whirlwind like I did in my arms guide, and you wanted to know if and when it was better to use a Whirlwind over a slam when Sweeping Strikes was up. If you wanted to be perfectly accurate with that comparison, you'd need to find the damage formulas for both abilities, then you'd need to figure out how much attack power you had, what the damage range was for the weapon that you were using, and then you need to account for the armor on the targets being hit, then account for crit chance, and so on and so forth. But remember the question that we want answered here. The question wasn't how much damage each of these abilities do. The question was, at what point would Whirlwind do more damage than a Sweeping Strike slam? The specific numbers don't actually matter. The difference between those numbers is what matters. If you remember back to your early algebra lessons, if you had an equation that looks like 5x equals 5y, then you could get rid of the 5 in front of both variables because as long as you do the same operation to both sides of the equation, it's okay. Which in this case, you could just divide both sides by 5 and then you get x equals y. We can use this property to effectively let us ignore a lot of the things that we might think would need to be considered. Basically, when comparing two things, we can think of each reference point as being on each side of the equation. And in that reference point, there's stuff that's the same on both sides, and then there's stuff that's different on both sides. As long as we only care about the proportional difference and not the actual numbers, then we can basically just ignore the stuff that's the same. This makes it so that we don't have to do a ton of extra math, and it lets us ignore certain problems with the comparison as long as the problems are the same for both reference points. This is a long, drawn-out, and somewhat ironic way of saying that you actually don't need to worry about the math as much as you probably think you do in the vast majority of situations. Now, with that tangent over, let's talk about two metrics that I like to use when doing this sort of in-depth analysis. The first metric that I like to look at is proportional ability usage. This metric can be useful for detecting problems with ability prioritization. Basically, what this metric does is that it spits out what proportion of your button presses were each of your main damaging abilities. On its own, it's generally not that useful, but if you do the same analysis on a gear sim or on the logs of somebody who performed better than you, you'll be able to see fairly clearly what the difference in ability usage was. This metric is also pretty robust in that it doesn't really matter if there's a difference in fight lengths being compared. Here's how to get to this metric. For a fight that you want to analyze, in this case, it'll be Beoward's Hungering Destroyer kill. Look at the number of times you cast each of your typical damaging abilities, and throw those numbers into your spreadsheet. Then below that, add all those numbers up to give you the total number of damaging abilities that you used during that fight. Next, what you want to do is, for each of these abilities, you want to divide it by the total. So for Condemn, we would do equals, click that, and then divide by that. Now, a trick that we can use to make our life a little easier is, once we've clicked on our total, hit F4, because that locks it in, so when we drag it, it'll stay the same, right? So we do that, and of course it messes with the formatting, but whatever. But as you can see, the whole time it stays at E13 for all of them, but it lets the other one change. Okay? So now, what this tells us is, what's the percentage of all of the uses that was Condemn, Mortal Strike, so on and so forth. And since this is a percentage, we can just change it to a percent. And I personally like to have it with 2 decimals, but that's just personal preference. Next, you'll want to do the same thing, but for whatever you're comparing yourselves to. If you're comparing yourself to a log of another warrior, then the process is the exact same. If you're comparing yourself to a sim, then what you should do is run a quick sim on raid bots. When you do this, make sure that the settings make it so that the simulation is as close to what happened in the fight as possible. In this case, I set the fight length to 4 minutes, I turned off the monk debuff and Wind Fury totem, and then I set the fight style to light movement. Now, once the simulation completes, you're going to want to go to the full HTML report, which is this link right here on the right side of your screen. And so when you do, you'll see this, and then you can scroll on down until you see the abilities tab. Now, in here, there are two numbers that you could use to look at. You could either use execute, which is the average number of times the action is executed per iteration, or you could do the count, which is the number of times that it impacted. Now, normally for arms, these would be the exact same, but for some reason, condemn is basically double counted in execute. And I think that has something to do with the damage absorbed that condemn applies, but I'm not sure. So in this case, I'm going to use count, and I'm also going to round down in the vast majority of cases. That's just a personal habit for consistency, but it really doesn't matter. Just be consistent with whatever it is that you decide to do. Once we have our numbers entered in, we're going to do the exact same thing, but for the simulation. So we're going to hit equals, hit the condemn number, and divide it by the total, and hit F4. And then we're going to drag it on down. Okay, just because that annoys me. And once again, we're going to change this to a percentage, and I like to have 2 digits. Okay, so now that we have this, we can ask basically what's the difference between Beoward's proportional condemn usage and what the sim was doing. So we just put in we click on his number, and then we subtract it from that, right? And we can see that it's there, and then what we do is we drag it all the way down. Now, you don't really need to do this, but for the sake of making it even more clear, I'm going to add some conditional formatting, right? So what does this tell us? It tells us that Beoward used condemn 4% more often than the simulation did, right? On a given GCD, he's 4% more likely to use condemn. He also used Mortal Strike 2% less often. He used Overpower about 1% less often. And then Slam, a little bit less. Colossus Smash was, they had the same ability usage, so it's fine. And relatively speaking, he used Skull Splitter about the same, right? It's close enough to 0. If it was at 0, that means that that you had it proportionally the exact same amount. If it's positive, that means you're using it more. If it's negative, that means that you're using it less. Whenever you're doing any sort of analysis and you wind up with something that looks like it could be an answer to your question, I think that it is vitally important to ask yourself 3 questions. First, what is this metric actually saying? 2, what could cause the outcome that you're seeing? And 3, what is the metric not saying? In this case, the metric is telling us the difference in the proportions of how frequently we use an ability. In other words, if you have a pie that contains all of the abilities that we're looking at, each of those abilities will fit up a slice of that pie. This metric compares the sizes of each slice of that pie to whatever it is that we're comparing ourselves to. In this case, it's the simulation, though it could also be another warrior. And it's saying, what's the difference in the sizes of each of those slices? Now, this metric will tell us if there's a difference and what that difference is, but does not tell us why there was a difference. That's something that we have to come up with ourselves. In this case, we can see that condemn usage was up. Now, this could mean that Beoward was in the condemn windows longer than what the simulation was, meaning he would naturally cast more condemns. Or it could potentially mean that he used an expected amount of condemn, but didn't use his other abilities as much as he should have, making it look relatively higher. In this particular case, my suspicion is that the difference is most likely due to having a longer condemn window, because if you look at the difference in overpower usage, the difference is about half of what it is for Mortal Strike and Slam, though losing out on Slams and Mortal Strikes due to rage starvation is something that cannot be ruled out. The result of this analysis is that when Beoward presses a button, in general it seems that he's pressing the correct one. Now, what this metric doesn't tell us is whether or not he's hitting as many buttons as he should be. This is an important point because while this metric tells us a lot, it doesn't give us a complete picture. So we're going to need to do a bit more analysis if we want to really figure out if there's any problems with his ability usage. This leads us to the second metric that I want to highlight, which attempts to measure what percentage of global cooldowns available were actually used. To do this, we're going to need to come up with a number for how many global cooldowns we could have used, and also a number for how many global cooldowns we did use. Conveniently, we're already most of the way there to having the number of GCDs used in our spreadsheet, because we can just take the ability usage counts from our previous metric, and then count up any of the abilities that cause a global cooldown that we didn't already count. Once we do that, we can see that Beoward used a total of 144 global cooldowns. Now, to figure out how many global cooldowns were possible during that fight, we need to take a look at his haste. According to the logs, he had 321 haste. Now, at level 60, you get 1% haste for every 33 haste rating. This comes out to him having about 9.73% haste. Now, at this point, we have a choice to make. We need to decide if we care about being accurate with our numbers, or if we care about just seeing if there's an obvious problem. If we care about accuracy, then we're going to need to do a whole lot more math, and we're going to need to account for non-permanent sources of haste like Dark Moon Veracity Trinket, Lust, thrill seeker, haste food, and so on and so forth. If all we care about is looking for the obvious signs of a problem, then we can simply just not account for these things as long as we do the same thing for the logs that we're comparing ourselves to. And as long as the kill time is basically the same, because that'll mean that both logs will have the same uptime on these effects. If we do this, that'll make our metric precise, but not accurate. Now, for the sake of making things easier to follow, I'm going to forgo accounting for all these sources of haste. What this will mean for the end result is that the values are going to be somewhat inflated, because both warriors will have had the opportunity to use more global cooldowns than what we're counting. So, back to the math. The formula to determine the length of each global cooldown is 1.5 divided by 1 plus the haste percentage. So in this case, that would be 1.5 divided by 1.0973, which means that Beoward has a global cooldown of 1.37 seconds. Now we can divide the fight length by that number, and that'll tell us the total number of global cooldowns possible for that fight. 4 minutes and 17 seconds is 257 seconds, which means that in theory, Beoward could have used up to 187 global cooldown. So when we divide the 144 that he used by 187, we get a global cooldown utilization of 77%. Now, on its own, this might look pretty bad, but remember, he's running out for things like Expunge and also Consume, so he's not going to have 100% uptime on the boss. So really, we need to look at a suitable reference to see if there's anything to be concerned about with this number. In this example, we're going to be comparing Beoward to a warrior named Orchestrator, who had a similar kill time and did roughly 500 more DPS than Beoward. Now, some obvious yeah buts that go with his DPS difference is that Orchestrator had better trinkets, a slightly better weapon, and he also had a monk in his raid for the 5% physical damage debuff. Most importantly for our purposes though, he was running out for Expunge, so let's calculate Orchestrator's GCD usage and see how it compares to Beoward. Orchestrator used 171 global cooldowns over the course of this fight, though he has 619 haste rating, which equates to 18.76% haste. Based on this, his GCD duration was 1.26 seconds, and that means that he could have used up to 204 global cooldowns over the course of the fight. This means that Orchestrator had a GCD utilization of 83.82%. This is a difference in utilization of roughly 7%. So let's try and answer the same 3 questions about this result that we used for the last metric. So first, what is this metric telling us? This metric tells us what percentage of the possible GCDs that we could have used were in fact used. And then we use that to compare it to another warrior who did the same fight but did more DPS. In this particular case, it means that for each GCD that we could have used, the other warrior did something with that global cooldown nearly 7% more often than Beoward. The second question is, of course, what could cause the outcome that we're seeing? The most obvious explanations for this difference is that Orchestrator probably had better uptime of the boss, or maybe they were rage-starved less often over the course of the fight. Finally, what is this metric not telling us? This particular metric says nothing about whether or not the abilities that were being used to fill these global cooldowns were the correct ones. It would be entirely possible to cheese this metric by spamming hamstring the entire fight. Now, if you did this, yeah, you probably would have great GCD utilization, but your damage would be utter garbage, which is why I'm particularly fond of the 2 metrics that I've highlighted in this video, because each metric takes care of the limitations of the other metric. So after all this, what conclusions can be made about what Beoward should work on to improve? Now, I ran the metrics that I covered in this video for a number of the other fights that were in the logs he provided, and in general, the results were the same. His GCD utilization was a bit concerning, but he was using his abilities in their expected proportions. The biggest thing that would improve his DPS would be to figure out ways to use his abilities more often. Now, this could be accomplished by a combination of trying to maximize your uptime on mobs, and also ensuring that you're not rage-starving yourself. Also, because I didn't see you charge weaving regularly, that is something that I would recommend practicing because it can really help shorten the time that you spend rage-starved. As always, I want you to tell me the problems with what I've presented in this video. Why is analyzing logs in this way stupid? Why are my metrics bad? And why don't they work the way that I say they do? Also, if you have any tricks or things that you always look for in analyzing logs, I'd love to hear about them. And finally, I just want to say thank you for watching this video, and subscribe for more.